Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian, on this Sunday in May. And so today we are wrapping up our series on Jonah. We're in Jonah chapter 4. And then next week we will move on and celebrate Pentecost, the birthday of the church. And so Jonah 4, starting in verse 1. And so when we wrapped up Jonah 3, Jonah he'd gone into Nineveh and he had proclaimed the destruction of Nineveh. The people repent, even the animals are covered in sackcloth. And then God saw their acts, how they had turned back from their evil way, and God relented from the evil that God said to do to them, and God did not do it. So the people of Nineveh have been spared. Happy ending for the people of Nineveh, not so much for Jonah. And the thing was very evil for Jonah, and Jonah was incensed. And Jonah prayed to the Lord and said, I beseech you, Lord, was it not my word when I was still in my land? Therefore did I hasten to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in kindness and relenting from evil. And now, Lord, take my life, pray from me, for better my death than my life. And the Lord said, Are you good and angry? And Jonah went out of the city and sat down to the east of the city and made himself a shelter there, and sat under it in the shade till he might see what would happen in the city. And the Lord set out a plant, and it rose up over Jonah to be a shade over his head to save him from his evil plight. And Jonah rejoiced greatly over the plant, and God set out a worm as dawn came up on the morrow, and it struck the plant, and it withered. And it happened as the sun rose that God set out a slashing east wind, and the sun struck Jonah's head, and he grew faint and wanted to die. And he said, Better my death than my life. And God said to Jonah, Are you good and angry over the plant? And he said, I am good and angry to the point of death. And the Lord said, You had pity over the plant for which you did not toil and you did not grow, which overnight came and overnight was gone. And shall I not have pity for Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 human beings who do not know between their right hand and their left, and many beasts? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Jonah absolutely needs to be made into a movie. I mean, it is a roller coaster of emotions and these incredible events that we see. And it seems like it'd be a great movie, especially when compared to some of the other movies that have been made lately. Maybe, Netflix could make it into an 8 or a 10-part series, since that's apparently the way that things are done. You could binge watch it in one weekend. But there's all these elements of a great movie. But I was thinking about how it would contrast with the way Jonah might have portrayed it through his social media accounts. And I think it would be very different, because Jonah would likely leave out the part in the very beginning where God tells him to go to Nineveh. And Jonah would say, I got on a ship and I was headed for Tarshish. And then this great wind came up. And Jonah might exclude the part where it was sort of his fault that the storm came up and they sort of threw him overboard to cease the storm. And maybe Jonah would just say, in the midst of the storm, I ended up overboard and this fish swallowed me. And then Jonah would likely on social media have this incredible prayer that he prayed, and then have himself, vomited up onto dry land, and he would march triumphantly into the city and save the city, and that would be it, right? That would be what Jonah would post, and it would be very different than what we see, right? Because often social media is very different than real life, right? People will construct an image or a lifestyle that perhaps doesn't reflect reality because that's what they want you to see. And if you go on there, you often see that people's lives look very perfect when no one's life is. But that's what they construct. And often, people then start feeling like they need to keep up with that self-constructed perfection of other people. And if everybody else is doing great, then I need to be doing better. And so you start feel like you're falling behind. You get anxiety in trying to keep up with this, with a constructed image that isn't real. And so when I think about Jonah and how Jonah might have portrayed this on Jonah's social media accounts, if such a thing were in existence back then, it wouldn't reflect Jonah. And what's interesting is that, Jonah here in chapter 4 is sort of accusing God of being, gracious, right? Jonah says, I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in kindness and relenting from evil. And it's got to be one of the few times somebody gets upset over this. But Jonah hated Nineveh so much, he was so eager to see it destroyed, that to him this was a terrible thing. But even when Jonah is sort of accusing God here, God doesn't look at Jonah and say, look at the things you did wrong. Because Jonah would say Nineveh is this evil and wicked city, and God never says to Jonah, well, what about the evil things you did? What about the things you did that caused the storm, about you fleeing from my word? God doesn't throw that back in Jonah's face, because that's not how God acts, and so God doesn't do the same to you. Right? Even if you're pointing out what someone else has done wrong, God doesn't look at you and say, oh, but you did this and you did this. Even though it's true, right? We're all evil. We're all broken. We all deserve the condemnation of God. And yet God doesn't throw that back at us, because God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abundant in kindness and relenting from evil. This is the kind of God that we worship. And so we don't have to hide our failures and our weaknesses and hope that nobody notices. We can be open and we can be vulnerable about them, right? Because God's not throwing it back at us. Those things don't condemn us any more than they condemned Jonah, any more than they condemned the people of Nineveh. And so we can give thanks that we worship a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abundant in kindness. We don't have to hide our faults, because God doesn't throw them back at us. And so we can be honest about them. And so Jonah gets good and angry about this. And there's also this incident with the plant. And what's fascinating is that, so Jonah goes out east of the city, and basically what happens is, God has relented, but Jonah goes out east of the city and sets up camp in the hopes that perhaps God will change God's mind and rain down fire and brimstone, and Jonah can sit out there and watch it. And so this is what Jonah goes out to do. And God causes this plant to grow that provides Jonah all this shade. And so Jonah is very comfortable out there in his camp that he has set up. And then God sends this worm. And so if you're keeping score at home, God has used a great fish and a worm. Who knows what is next? And this worm attacks the plant, and the plant dies. And then Jonah becomes so upset over the death of this plant that he is ready to die. It's a good thing Jonah doesn't live in my house, where plants die all the time. But Jonah is so upset over this. And it's an inconvenience, right? It is causing discomfort. Jonah had the convenience of this plant offering shade, and then he is inconvenienced. And God is saying, you're so upset over this plant, but what about the people? God says, you didn't do any work for this plant, but what about the people? God says, that I have made, that are precious to me. Should I not have pity on them? Should I not care for them far more than you care for this plant, which was simply a convenience to you? And that's how the story ends. And it forces us to think about conveniences for us, because often conveniences shield us from hardship in the world, and they keep us from seeing sort of the whole situation. A convenience it can be a good thing, but it can make us so comfortable that we don't see the world necessarily as it is. We see it through the lens of that convenience. And so sometimes those conveniences are stripped away. And here's my challenge for you, is that when those conveniences are stripped away, when you are inconvenienced, think of it as an opportunity to see the world through a different lens. Think of it as an opportunity to see needs that are in the world, to maybe see the discomfort of others. Because as Christians, when we see that, often we just don't see, but when we see, we are then compelled to help, to serve, right? Because we serve a compassionate God, we are then called to be compassionate. So when we see needs and wants of others, we're compelled to stand in that gap and to serve others in love and in grace. And so, again, think of your inconveniences as opportunities to see the world from a different perspective, and to think about how God is calling you to respond and to meet the needs of others. And so as I mentioned earlier, so Jonah, we discover he hates the people of Nineveh, and he wanted to see their destruction. And I just want to close with a word about tribalism. And there's a lot of talk about how we find tribes, and tribes are important, right? They help us, they give us a sense of identity, they help us build a sense of community, and it's very important that we find tribes, that we find community that support us and challenge us and help us to think and to grow. And they gather around us and they provide us their strength when we need it. But they can hinder us as well. Because what do we do with people who are outside of our tribes, who are not a part of our tribe? And it's easy to think about in the realm of sports, right? You know, as people who live in Columbus, there's a rivalry between Ohio and Michigan, and certainly personified in the Ohio State-Michigan football game. And there are tribes there, and there's strong tribal rivalry. But if you saw someone who was a Michigan fan and they needed help, you might needle them a little, but you would likely help them if you had the capability to do so, because it's just a football game, right? It's a friendly rivalry, right? If you had the power to help them, you likely would. Or think of it, if you're a Cleveland Browns fan and there's a rivalry with the Steelers, right? But if you had the capability and you saw someone who genuinely needed help, who was a fan of the other team, you likely would, because it's just a football game, right? But what happens with things where we don't think like that, where it's not just a football game? And you see this a lot around politics lately. This split between Democrats and Republicans, and there seems to be a stauncher and stauncher sense of tribalism and a dismissiveness of those who are in the other tribe. And it frightens me. It disturbs me the way that I see online. I'm not an active user of social media. I kind of view it. I observe. And it's interesting that the dismissiveness that comes within that. And you see at times a wishing for bad things to happen to the other tribe. And it's concerning because, again, as I know I've said before, losing that sense of common humanity between tribes and recognize that we're all part of a larger tribe is important for us to thrive as a global community. And so we think about and we see the tribalism between Democrats and Republicans and this dismissiveness of the other side of it. And there's not an easy solution there, right? These are complex problems that divide them. And similarly, the war, the conflict that is going on right now between Israel and Palestine, right? It is a complex situation that has been going on for decades and for centuries. And I will not pretend to be intelligent enough and to have a thorough grasp of each side of the situation. I've read a lot about it, and I understand the arguments on each side of it. I don't know how to bridge that. Lots of people far more intelligent than I have tried. But what we're reading here in Jonah 4 is that God's challenge to Jonah is God is saying to Jonah, shall I not have pity for Nineveh, the great city with 120,000 people in it? Shall I not have pity for them? No matter what their evil deeds were, no matter what their wickedness may have been, should I not have pity for them? And God is sort of saying, just as I had pity on you, Jonah, when you ran, when you disobeyed, when you did evil, I had pity on you, should I not have pity on Nineveh? And when we think about our tribes, how do we think about that other tribe, and how do we as Christians go forward with the sense of we should have pity for them, for we're all in a common situation. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, Paul tells us in Romans. We are all we have this common humanity, and so we need to start each interaction with people thinking about this common humanity, thinking about how we can help one another thrive. How do we start each interaction with people thinking of God's deep concern for them? Right? When you engage online with someone, it's so easy for that to be antagonistic, for it to be dismissive. How do you engage online with someone and remember God's deep concern for that person you're engaging with, as well as every single tribe or person about which you are debating? Think of God's great concern for them. If we start in that place of a fundamental concern for the well-being of every person, right, then we as Christians have a chance to influence not only the tenor of the debates, but perhaps their outcome as well. Because if we're concerned for the humanity of everyone involved, right, that's a powerful witness about God's concern for all, about God's great reach to all people. And so that's my hope for us as Christians, that as we engage online, that as we interact with people, that we think first of God's question here at the end of Jonah 4. If God is saying, should I not have pity on them? We think of the pity that God has on us when God sent Jesus Christ. While we were enemies of God, while we were sinners, God sent Jesus Christ out of pity, out of mercy, out of kindness, out of compassion to love and to save us when Jesus Christ died on the cross. And may we realize that God loves each of us. And God pours that love into us. And so may we root our interactions in that great love of God, the great love with which God loves us. And may we interact online, may we interact in the world from a place rooted in that love and God's concern for all. Thanks be to God.